We begin tonight with civil rights for 43 million Americans who are physically disabled. After one of its most moving sessions in years, the Senate has passed legislation which guarantees people with disabilities greater access to everyday American life. One of the bill's sponsors said today that it marked the end of a condescending approach to Americans with disabilities.
In 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, was passed into law, prohibiting discrimination against disabled Americans and protecting their basic rights to access public buildings, telecommunications, transportation, and employment. Much like previous civil rights movements, the ADA gained support through protests, congressional lobbying, and negotiations with politicians. The passage of the ADA was a turning point in how Americans with disabilities were treated, and a landmark law affirming the inherent dignity of America's largest minority group. Throughout history, disability was perceived as a problem requiring a solution, not as an integral aspect of identity. Asylums and schools were created to remove disabled people from their communities. The stigma was worsened by social Darwinism, which led to the belief that disability was a denigration of the species. Physicians allowed disabled newborns to die, and by 1938, forced sterilizations on people with intellectual disabilities were being performed legally in 33 states. The American bestseller Sterilization for Human Betterment was reprinted in Germany in 1933 and was a model for Hitler. Ugly laws prohibited people with unsightly disabilities from appearing in public, and idiot laws prevented people with intellectual disabilities from marrying. Legal protection for people with disabilities was at best charity and at worst dehumanizing. In the mid-20th century, building on the growing civil rights movement, people with disabilities began fighting the barriers that excluded them from living and working in their communities. Parents of children with disabilities fought against the exclusion and segregation of their children in education. The independent living movement challenged the notion that people with disabilities needed to be institutionalized. Many organizations were founded to build a nationwide coalition of support. Disabled activists adopted many strategies from the civil rights movement of 1964. Protesters stopped buses and attended rallies, staged sit-ins, and caused disruption. The so-called silent minority wasn't so silent anymore, and they came with numbers. Activism played a key role in securing congressional votes due to public outcry. Disabled activist and lobbyist Justin Dart held public hearings in every state to collect discrimination diaries, which were accounts of disability discrimination in the U.S. On March 13, 1990, over 1,000 people were protesting at the Capitol when disabled men, women, and children, including 8-year-old Jennifer Keelan Chaffins, the so-called face of the disability rights movement, got out of their wheelchairs and crawled up the 82 steps of the Capitol. This dramatic presentation captured the public's attention and put pressure on politicians.
The Capitol crawl not only got Congress's attention as to why it was important to pass the ADA, but it also got worldwide attention as to why the issue was important.
Activism by the disabled community led to various pieces of legislation, but the first time the word discrimination was used related to people with disabilities was in Section 504 of the 1973 Rehabilitation Act. This was the first time people recognized disabled rights as civil rights. The law pertained only to programs and activities which received federal funds and was rarely enforced, but it opened the door for litigation on the grounds of discrimination for people with disabilities. The longest sit-in American history was for the enforcement of Section 504. Section 504 was a turning point because it recognized discrimination against people with disabilities. Disabled Americans called for a comprehensive disability rights law, the ADA. In the spring of 1988, Lowell Riker of Connecticut introduced the first draft of the ADA to the Senate, while Tony Caliho introduced it to the House. The bill had unusual bipartisan support in both the House and the Senate. By the spring of 1990, the bill was stalled in Congress over fears of people with AIDS handling food. And by June, the ADA was in grave peril of dying on the floor over the controversy on AIDS. The House had approved an amendment that would allow people with AIDS to be prevented from food handling jobs, called the Chapman Amendment. Disability rights activists announced that they were going to withdraw their support from the ADA over the Chapman Amendment. As a final vote was approaching on July 11, 1990, the ADA's sponsor, Senator Harkin, was ready to pull the bill, saying, "We cannot make a bill with built-in discrimination." That same day, Nancy Taylor, a staffer for Orrin Hatch, drafted a new amendment which authorized the CDC to prepare a list of communicable diseases that were scientifically known to be transmitted through food handling.
It was dead. Harkin just said, "We're not moving it any further. It's over." It was a very good decision to kind of think about it more in a scientific way. We shouldn't have members of Congress making that decision, but instead we should have CDC or NIH make that decision. If AIDS can be transmitted through the handling of food products, then it should not have reasonable accommodations, because you have to ensure safety of the food supply.
Hatch and Taylor knew that, given the latest medical and scientific knowledge, there was little to no chance that HIV/AIDS would appear on the list. This was a huge turning point in not only the ADA, but also the AIDS panic. The Hatch Amendment replaced the Chapman Amendment and turned decisions from fear and prejudice to science. On July 12 to 13, 1990, Congress took a vote on the ADA. After countless revisions, hearings, debates, and witness testimonies of the horrors of discrimination, the roll call vote was 377 to 28 for the House and 91 to 6 for the Senate, a massive landslide. After being ratified by the President, it was signed on the White House lawn, freeing 42.5 million Americans, or 13% of the population. The ADA was made up of 4 main titles: employment, public services, public accommodations, and telecommunications. Title I required employers to provide reasonable accommodations and prohibited employment discrimination. This was arguably the most important part of the ADA, because disabled people were the largest unemployed minority. The prospect of getting so many people off welfare and into the workforce appealed to many Republicans. Title II prevented public entities from denying services or participation in programs or activities, including public transportation systems or anything operated by state or local government. Before passage of the ADA, it was difficult to stage protests because of the inaccessible transportation. Title III pertained to public facilities such as restaurants, hotels, etc., and required all new construction modifications to be accessible, and that in existing facilities, barriers must be removed if it does not cause undue hardship. This title sparked controversy due to its associated costs and vague language. Especially the phrase undue hardship frightened many politicians because of its ambiguity. Business owners would not know if they were in compliance, which would also bring unfounded lawsuits. Title IV provided telecommunications, mainly subtitles on TV, which was extremely rare at the time. It also required American Sign Language interpreters. In fact, the first time an ASL interpreter was featured on TV was on the floor debate for the ADA. The signing of the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990 was a pivotal turning point in U.S. history. It was the world's first comprehensive declaration of equality for people with disabilities. The passage of the ADA led to a societal shift that changed attitudes toward people with disabilities and changed expectations for inclusion and accessibility. The ADA has radically transformed the environment. Curb cuts, ramps, automatic doors, and elevators have made the world more accessible. Spaces are now designed based on the principles of universal design, and everyone benefits. Since 2000, 181 countries have enacted ADA-like laws. In 2006, the United Nations passed the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities with the largest landslide vote in the UN's history. The ADA is one of the most important civil rights laws in America. This turning point freed disabled Americans from discrimination. The ADA made a profound impact on history, affecting 13% of the population, and caused a societal shift that has changed the attitude towards disabled people. This law defended the largest U.S. minority and was to be the last major civil rights law.